"You have to choose," the surgeon said, his voice low enough to make the silence feel even heavier. "We may only be able to save the mother or the baby." Ethan Caldwell stood frozen outside the emergency operating room, as if the polished hospital floor had become concrete around his feet. Just hours earlier, he had been sitting inside the boardroom of the tallest building in downtown Charlotte, discussing billion-dollar acquisitions and international expansion. Now none of those numbers existed anymore. The expensive watch on his wrist, the tailored Italian suit, the private jet waiting at the airport, none of it could buy him another minute with the woman he had spent 2 years desperately trying to find. Through the narrow window in the operating room door, he caught a glimpse of her face beneath the bright surgical lights. Naomi Brooks looked impossibly pale, her tightly curled hair spread across the pillow, her breathing supported by quiet machines that seemed almost afraid to interrupt the fragile rhythm of the room. She looked smaller than he remembered, as though every difficult day she had lived without him had quietly taken something away. Ethan pressed one trembling hand against the cool glass, unable to convince himself that she was really there. For 732 days, he had searched for her. He had hired investigators across 5 states. He had visited shelters, community clinics, churches, and neighborhood centers where volunteers knew everyone by name. He had followed hundreds of false leads. Every time someone claimed they had seen a woman matching Naomi's description, hope pulled him forward only to leave him standing alone again. Yet somehow fate had hidden her only 40 miles from the city they once called home. A nurse hurried past carrying paperwork before stopping when she recognized him from the television screens that seemed to feature him every week. Her expression shifted from surprise to sympathy. "Mr. Caldwell?" she asked gently. Ethan barely looked at her. "How long has she been here?" The nurse hesitated. "She collapsed earlier this afternoon after finishing her volunteer shift." Ethan frowned. "Volunteer?" The woman nodded softly. "She spent every Wednesday helping at the free maternal health clinic, even when she wasn't feeling well herself." His chest tightened painfully. That sounded exactly like Naomi. She had always believed someone else's pain deserved attention before her own. It was the first thing he had loved about her, and perhaps the reason losing her had never stopped hurting. The doctor stepped back into the hallway, removing one glove as exhaustion settled across his face. "Mr. Caldwell," he began carefully, "there's something else you need to know." Ethan lifted his eyes. She was 32 weeks pregnant. The words echoed through the hallway with a force greater than any explosion. "Pregnant?" His heartbeat stumbled. Every memory from 2 years ago came rushing back all at once. The rainy night he had walked away without explaining the truth. The tears she tried so hard not to let him see. The last time she whispered that she loved him even after he had deliberately broken her heart. Ethan slowly lowered himself into one of the empty waiting room chairs, unable to breathe normally anymore. He counted backward, searching for impossible math that might somehow prove the doctor wrong. But the calendar only confirmed what his heart already knew. The child was his. Naomi had carried their baby through every lonely mile, every uncertain morning, every frightening doctor appointment, believing he had abandoned her because he no longer cared. She had never known that walking away had been the greatest lie Ethan Caldwell had ever forced himself to tell. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor became the only sound Ethan Caldwell could focus on as the waiting room slowly emptied into the quiet hours of the night. Nurses moved with calm efficiency beneath soft fluorescent lights, while rain tapped gently against the tall hospital windows overlooking the parking lot. Everything felt strangely peaceful except for the storm inside his mind. He closed his eyes, and without warning the memories returned with startling clarity. 2 years earlier, there had been no hospital, no fear, no unanswered questions. There had only been a chilly Saturday morning in early October, when Ethan had decided to disappear from the world for a few hours. He often slipped away without security whenever the weight of being recognized became unbearable. That morning, wearing faded jeans, a gray sweatshirt, and an old baseball cap, he wandered into a neighborhood community center on the west side of Charlotte, where volunteers were serving breakfast to families facing difficult times. Nobody recognized him, and for the first time in months, that anonymity felt like freedom. He carried trays, poured coffee, wiped tables, and quietly followed instructions from anyone who needed an extra pair of hands. Then he heard a warm voice behind him. You were giving the children orange juice instead of apple juice." He turned quickly, expecting criticism, but instead found a woman smiling with patient amusement. Naomi Brooks held another pitcher in one hand while balancing a stack of paper cups against her hip with effortless confidence. Her eyes sparkled with kindness instead of judgment. "They will forgive you," she said softly. "But I thought you might want to know before they start negotiating for better juice." Ethan laughed, surprising even himself. It was a genuine laugh, untouched by board meetings or television interviews. "I guess I have already failed my first assignment," he admitted. Naomi smiled wider. "Not at all. Around here, showing up matters more than getting everything perfect." Those simple words stayed with him long after breakfast ended. During the following weeks, he found reasons to volunteer every Saturday morning. He never mentioned Caldwell Capital. He never mentioned magazine covers or private aircraft or investment portfolios. To Naomi, he was simply Ethan, a quiet man who stacked folding chairs a little too neatly and always arrived 15 minutes early. She told him about her work as a registered nurse at a neighborhood clinic where she cared for expectant mothers who often had nowhere else to go. She spoke about every patient with respect, never as a burden or a statistic. She remembered birthdays, favorite colors, and children's names with remarkable ease. Ethan found himself listening more than talking, discovering that her compassion made every expensive accomplishment in his own life seem strangely incomplete. They shared coffee from a small family-owned cafe, walked through public parks while autumn leaves drifted across the sidewalks, and spent evenings talking beneath string lights outside neighborhood food trucks where nobody expected a billionaire to stand in line. Naomi never asked what he earned, what he owned, or who he knew. She cared about whether he was sleeping enough, whether he called his mother often enough, and whether he remembered to enjoy sunsets instead of constantly checking his phone. For the first time since inheriting Caldwell Capital, Ethan felt something he had nearly forgotten was possible. Beside Naomi, he was no longer the billionaire everyone expected him to be. He was simply a man learning that the richest moments in life could never be measured by the balance inside a bank account. The secret could not stay hidden forever. One crisp November afternoon, Ethan invited Naomi to lunch at a quiet restaurant overlooking Freedom Park. Golden leaves drifted across the water while families pushed strollers along the walking trails nearby. They had just finished sharing a slice of warm pecan pie when Ethan's phone began vibrating across the table for what felt like the 10th time in an hour. He apologized with an embarrassed smile and reached to silence it, but the screen lit up before he could turn it over. Naomi caught only a brief glimpse of the headline flashing across the display. Caldwell Capital announces historic international merger. She looked from the screen back to Ethan, then noticed the dozens of unread messages filling the notification bar. Her gentle smile faded into quiet curiosity. "Ethan," she asked softly, "what exactly do you do?" For the first time since they had met, he could not find the right words. He had promised himself he would tell her before someone else did. Yet every week he postponed the conversation because he feared the truth would change the peaceful life they had built together. He took a slow breath and placed the phone on the table between them. "I own Caldwell Capital," he admitted. Naomi remained silent for several seconds. She searched his face, not with anger, but with surprise. "The Caldwell Capital?" she asked. Ethan nodded once. "I never wanted to lie to you." She leaned back in her chair and looked through the restaurant window at the calm lake beyond. "You did not exactly tell the truth either." The disappointment in her voice hurt far more than any public criticism he had ever faced. "I know," Ethan answered quietly. "I was afraid you would only see the headlines instead of me." Naomi studied him again before letting out a slow breath. "Do you know what I saw every Saturday morning?" she asked. "A man who carried chairs for elderly volunteers without being asked. A man who stayed late to wash dishes after everyone else had gone home. A man who remembered every child's favorite pancake topping. That is the Ethan I know." His shoulders relaxed slightly. "Then nothing has changed?" Naomi reached across the table and gently took his hand. "Your bank account changed long before we met. Your heart is the part that matters now." Ethan smiled for what felt like the first time that day, believing the difficult conversation had finally passed. He had no idea the real challenge was only beginning. Within 48 hours, photographs of them walking together appeared across business blogs and entertainment websites. Reporters camped outside the community clinic where Naomi worked. Television commentators debated whether the mysterious nurse would become Charlotte's newest socialite. Patients began recognizing her in the waiting room, making simple workdays increasingly difficult. Meanwhile, inside the Caldwell family estate, the atmosphere turned noticeably colder. Ethan's father, Richard Caldwell, stared silently at the photographs spread across his mahogany desk, while members of the family's executive team exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, Richard removed his reading glasses and spoke in a voice almost devoid of emotion. "This relationship ends now." Ethan met his father's gaze without hesitation. "No." Richard folded his hands carefully. "You think this is about appearances. It is not. The people standing behind our competitors are far more dangerous than you realize. They do not attack balance sheets first. They attack the people you love." Ethan frowned as confusion replaced defiance. His father slid a confidential folder across the desk. Inside were surveillance photographs of Naomi leaving the clinic, volunteering at the community center, and walking home alone after sunset. Ethan felt the color drain from his face as the realization settled over him. Someone had already begun watching her. Ethan barely slept after reading the surveillance reports. Every photograph felt like a silent warning that Naomi had never known existed. She continued living her ordinary life, greeting neighbors on morning walks, carrying grocery bags for elderly residents, laughing with children outside the community center, completely unaware that strangers had been documenting her every movement. Richard Caldwell did not raise his voice or issue dramatic threats. He simply placed another folder on the conference table the following morning. Inside were intelligence summaries describing an organized financial group that had already attempted to pressure Caldwell Capital through intimidation, public scandals, and personal leverage. Their latest conversations contained Naomi's name. Ethan closed the file slowly, every page making one truth impossible to ignore. As long as she remained close to him, she would never truly be safe. For 3 agonizing days he avoided her calls, canceled dinner plans with vague excuses, and buried himself inside endless meetings while searching for another solution. There was none. Every security consultant reached the same conclusion. If their enemies believed the relationship had ended, Naomi would no longer have value as leverage. If they believed Ethan still loved her, they would keep watching. On Friday evening, Naomi finally appeared outside Caldwell Capital headquarters just as employees were leaving for the weekend. Snow flurries drifted through the cold December air while city lights reflected across the glass towers surrounding the plaza. She spotted Ethan walking toward the entrance with his security team and smiled with obvious relief. "I was beginning to think something happened to you," she said gently. Ethan wanted nothing more than to pull her into his arms and tell her everything. Instead, he forced himself to step back. His expression became carefully distant. "We need to talk." Naomi searched his face, immediately sensing something was terribly wrong. "Did I do something?" she asked quietly. Ethan looked past her instead of into her eyes because he knew the moment he saw tears forming, his resolve would disappear. "This relationship has become inconvenient." The word tasted bitter before it even left his mouth. Naomi blinked in disbelief. "Inconvenient?" Ethan nodded without emotion. "My life is changing. My responsibilities are changing. I should never have allowed this to become serious." She stood perfectly still, as if the winter air itself had frozen around her. "You told me money never mattered to you," she whispered. Ethan swallowed hard, but continued playing the role he now hated more than anything. "I believed that for a while. I was wrong. We come from different worlds, Naomi. Eventually reality catches up with everyone." A long silence settled between them. Passing traffic hummed through downtown Charlotte, while snowflakes landed quietly on the shoulders of Naomi's dark blue coat. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. Instead, she looked at him with heartbreaking disappointment, the kind reserved for someone she had trusted completely. "Was any of it real?" she finally asked. Ethan felt every instinct inside him scream to tell her the truth. He imagined explaining the surveillance, the threats, the impossible choice, but one glance toward the black sedan parked across the street reminded him they were almost certainly still being watched. He hardened his expression one final time. "I think we both confused kindness with love." Naomi slowly lowered her eyes. The engagement ring Ethan had secretly planned to give her before Christmas remained hidden inside his coat pocket, suddenly feeling heavier than gold should ever feel. She slipped the small silver necklace he had once given her from beneath her sweater and placed it gently into his hand. "Then I hope one day you find whatever you believe is worth losing people over," she said softly. Without another word, she turned and disappeared into the falling snow. Ethan remained standing in the plaza long after she was gone, his fingers wrapped tightly around the necklace as tears blurred the skyline. Across the street, a man inside the parked sedan made a brief phone call before the vehicle quietly pulled away, convinced the woman Ethan Caldwell loved no longer mattered. Naomi did not cry until she reached the small apartment she rented above a neighborhood bakery on the east side of Charlotte. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the old wooden floors every morning, usually bringing her comfort. But that night, even the familiar warmth could not quiet the ache in her chest. She carefully placed her coat over the kitchen chair, brewed a cup of chamomile tea she never touched, and sat beside the window watching snow gather on the rooftops below. She replayed every conversation she and Ethan had ever shared, searching for the moment everything had changed. The answer never came. 3 weeks later, another unexpected change quietly entered her life. During a routine shift at the community clinic, one of her coworkers insisted she stop ignoring the constant fatigue that had begun slowing her down. Naomi smiled politely, assuming the long hours and emotional strain were finally catching up with her. But the examination revealed something she never imagined. She was expecting a baby. The tiny heartbeat echoing through the examination room filled her eyes with tears before the nurse even finished speaking. Joy arrived at the exact same moment as heartbreak. She held the printed ultrasound photo with trembling hands, whispering through a fragile smile, "Your father may never know how much he already loves you." She never tried calling Ethan. His final words still echoed too clearly inside her heart, and she refused to force someone into a life they had already chosen to leave behind. Instead, she quietly resigned from her apartment lease, accepted a nursing position at a nonprofit maternal health clinic in the small coastal town of Beaufort, North Carolina, and disappeared without telling anyone except her closest supervisor. She believed distance would protect both her heart and her child. Meanwhile, Ethan buried himself in work that no longer felt meaningful. Behind closed boardroom doors, he spent months helping federal investigators expose the financial network that had threatened his family and targeted innocent people connected to Caldwell Capital. Confidential meetings replaced public appearances. Long nights replaced celebrations. Richard Caldwell watched his son grow quieter with every passing season. When the final investigation concluded nearly a year later, the atmosphere inside the Caldwell estate felt strangely empty instead of victorious. Richard entered Ethan's office carrying the last sealed report before placing it gently on the desk. "It is over," he said. Ethan looked up slowly. "Are you certain?" Richard nodded. "The people responsible no longer have the influence they once did. No one is watching her anymore." Ethan stared at the silver necklace still resting inside the top drawer of his desk exactly where he had left it on the night Naomi walked away. Dust had settled across the velvet box that held the engagement ring he had never been able to give her. He reached for both with shaking hands, realizing the sacrifice that had once seemed necessary had now become unbearable. The following morning, he drove to the community center where they first met. New volunteers greeted families with warm smiles, but no one recognized Naomi's name anymore. The neighborhood cafe where they once shared coffee had hired new staff. The owner remembered her kindness, but quietly explained that she had moved away many months earlier without leaving a forwarding address. Ethan expanded the search week after week, traveling across North Carolina whenever a hopeful lead appeared. Every small town, every church bulletin board, every free clinic became another possibility. Sometimes he arrived only hours after someone claimed a compassionate nurse matching Naomi's description had volunteered there. Sometimes he found nothing at all except another road stretching toward the horizon. Seasons continued changing around him. Spring flowers bloomed. Summer sunlight shimmered across highways. Autumn leaves returned once. Again. Through it all, one thought refused to leave his heart. Somewhere beyond those endless miles, Naomi was building a new life without ever knowing that every cruel word he had spoken had been the greatest lie he had ever told. Nearly 2 years after Naomi disappeared from his life, Ethan found himself driving along a quiet coastal highway just before sunset, following one final lead that seemed no more promising than the hundreds before it. An elderly pastor from a small church had remembered a compassionate nurse named Naomi who volunteered every Wednesday at a nonprofit maternal health clinic outside Beaufort. He had smiled warmly before pointing Ethan toward a narrow road lined with towering oak trees draped in Spanish moss. "If you were talking about Miss Brooks," the pastor had said, "she spends more time helping other people than talking about herself." Ethan thanked him and continued driving with cautious hope, refusing to let himself imagine too much. The clinic appeared at the end of a gravel driveway overlooking a peaceful marsh where tall reeds swayed gently in the evening breeze. It was a modest brick building with white wooden trim, flower boxes beneath every window, and a hand-painted sign that read, "Hope Harbor Family Clinic." Children laughed quietly near a small playground, while volunteers carried donated boxes of diapers and baby blankets through the front entrance. The place felt nothing like the polished hospitals Ethan had funded over the years. It felt lived in. It felt human. He stepped from his car just as the golden light of late afternoon stretched across the parking lot. Before he reached the entrance, the front door opened. A young volunteer pushed a wheelchair outside for an elderly patient, thanking her softly before helping her into a waiting car. Then Ethan saw her. Naomi stood beneath the porch light, holding a clipboard against her chest. For a long moment, he could not breathe. She looked thinner than he remembered, her gentle face carrying the quiet exhaustion of someone who had spent too many nights caring for everyone except herself. Yet the kindness in her eyes had not changed. Neither had the calm grace with which she thanked every volunteer by name before they left for the evening. Then his eyes dropped lower. Beneath her light blue cardigan, her pregnancy was unmistakable. Time seemed to stop. The sounds of children playing, birds calling across the marsh, even the distant waves beyond the reeds all faded into silence. Ethan instinctively took one step forward before stopping himself. She did not know he was there. She was smiling at a frightened young mother, placing a reassuring hand over the woman's shoulder while quietly explaining something that immediately eased the woman's worried expression. It was exactly who Naomi had always been. She healed people long before medicine ever could. When the young family drove away, Naomi remained standing alone on the porch for a moment, one hand resting gently against her stomach as she watched the sunset paint the sky in soft shades of orange and rose. The breeze lifted a few loose curls across her face, and she closed her eyes briefly as though gathering enough strength to finish one more difficult day. Ethan noticed how carefully she steadied herself against the porch railing before taking a slow breath. She looked tired in a way that reached far beyond ordinary exhaustion. His heart tightened with a fear he could not yet explain. He wanted to run toward her, to apologize for every painful word, to tell her the truth he had carried alone for 2 years, but guilt rooted him to the ground. Watching from the edge of the parking lot, he realized that while he had spent 2 years searching for Naomi, she had spent those same years quietly carrying far more than he had ever imagined. And for the first time since losing her, Ethan understood that finding someone was not the same as deserving another chance. The following morning, Ethan returned before sunrise, parking several buildings away so he would not attract attention. A light mist drifted over the marsh as seabirds circled above the quiet water, and the first rays of sunlight painted the clinic windows with a warm golden glow. He watched volunteers begin arriving one by one, each greeted by Naomi with the same gentle smile he remembered. Even carrying the weight of late pregnancy, she insisted on holding the front door open for everyone else before stepping inside herself. Ethan remained where he was, uncertain whether revealing himself would heal anything or only reopen wounds she had spent 2 years trying to close. An elderly physician eventually noticed the unfamiliar man standing alone beside the fence and walked over with a curious expression. "Can I help you?" he asked kindly. Ethan hesitated before answering. "I am looking for Naomi Brooks." The doctor's smile softened. "You are not the first person to say that. Everyone around here depends on Naomi." He glanced back toward the clinic before lowering his voice. "Although lately we have all been worried about her." Ethan felt his heartbeat quicken. "Why?" The doctor folded his hands inside the pockets of his white coat. "She has been ignoring her own health for months. She keeps giving every bit of her energy to other mothers instead of herself. She says there is always someone who needs help more than she does. Ethan stared silently through the clinic window where Naomi was comforting a frightened young couple. The doctor continued, unaware of the history, standing beside him. She has also been donating blood whenever emergencies come up. We have asked her to stop because of her pregnancy, but she never likes turning people away. Ethan looked at him in disbelief. She has been doing all of that while expecting a baby? The doctor nodded with quiet admiration. That is Naomi. She has always believed compassion comes first. A heavy silence settled between them before the physician spoke again. She collapsed yesterday because her body has been under too much strain. We convinced her to come to the hospital for additional testing, but she insisted on finishing her shift before leaving. Ethan lowered his eyes, remembering every moment Naomi had ever placed someone else's well-being ahead of her own. Nothing about her had changed except that she had been carrying those burdens alone. As they spoke, the front door opened once more. Naomi stepped outside holding a small knitted baby blanket, smiling as she handed it to a young mother preparing to leave with her newborn daughter. The little girl wrapped tiny fingers around Naomi's hand, making her laugh softly despite the obvious fatigue in her face. Ethan felt tears gather as he realized the woman before him had built an entire life around hope, while believing the man she loved had willingly abandoned her. The doctor glanced toward Ethan again. Forgive me for asking, but how do you know Naomi? Ethan struggled to answer. Before he could speak, a nurse hurried out of the clinic carrying a patient chart. Dr. Harris, she called urgently. The laboratory confirmed the results. Naomi's condition is getting worse. We need to transfer her today. Ethan instinctively stepped closer. What condition? Dr. Harris exhaled slowly before meeting his eyes. Severe complications have placed both her and the baby at serious risk. She kept delaying treatment because she refused to stop caring for everyone else. Ethan felt the world grow painfully quiet. Then his gaze shifted through the clinic doorway once more, where a little boy waiting with his mother looked up at Naomi and smiled. She smiled back with the same warmth she had once given him, completely unaware that the father of her unborn child was standing only a few yards away, finally understanding that the greatest sacrifice in their story had never been his alone. Dr. Harris arranged the transfer within the hour, but before the ambulance doors closed, Naomi finally noticed the familiar figure standing quietly near the entrance of the clinic. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. The sounds of rolling wheels, distant gulls, and gentle waves seemed to fade beneath the weight of 2 years of silence. Ethan stepped forward slowly, afraid that even one sudden movement might cause her to turn away. Naomi looked at him with tired eyes filled not with anger, but with disbelief. "How did you find me?" she asked softly. Ethan struggled to steady his voice. "I never stopped looking." She lowered her gaze, resting one protective hand over her stomach. "You were the one who left." Every word landed with quiet truth. Ethan nodded without trying to defend himself. "I know." She searched his face, waiting for the cold man who had broken her heart to appear again, but he was gone. Standing before her was only the man who had once washed dishes beside her at the community center and laughed over the wrong kind of orange juice. Dr. Harris gently interrupted. "We need to leave now." Ethan looked toward the physician. "May I come with her?" Naomi answered before anyone else could. "If you want to come, then come. But do not expect the past to disappear just because you finally found me." Ethan simply nodded. During the drive to the regional hospital, he remained seated across from her, saying almost nothing. Every few minutes he looked up, making certain she was comfortable before quietly looking away again. He no longer believed words alone deserved to be trusted. They arrived just before noon, and the medical team immediately began preparing additional examinations. Ethan completed every admission document the nurses handed him without mentioning his position or his wealth. When billing specialists recognized his name and offered to move Naomi into an exclusive private suite reserved for high-profile patients, he politely declined after hearing Naomi whisper, "Please keep me where every other mother is treated." He respected her wish without hesitation. Throughout the afternoon, Ethan stayed in the family waiting area instead of making phone calls to executives or rearranging business meetings. He brewed coffee for exhausted husbands, carried extra blankets to elderly visitors whose loved ones were recovering upstairs, and entertained a restless little boy by helping him build paper airplanes from unused cafeteria napkins. Several nurses quietly thanked him, never realizing the billionaire they had seen on magazine covers had willingly become another ordinary visitor hoping for good news. Late that evening, Dr. Harris entered the waiting room with updated test results. "She is stable for now," he said with cautious optimism. Ethan released the breath he had been holding for hours. "What does she need most?" The doctor smiled gently. "Rest. Consistency. Someone who stays." Those final words settled deeply inside Ethan's heart. They reminded him of the simple sketch Naomi had once drawn, of a figure protecting two children beneath a tree, labeled only "the one who stays." He understood now that love had never been measured by dramatic sacrifices or expensive promises. It was measured by quiet presence on ordinary days. When visiting hours finally resumed the next morning, Ethan knocked softly before entering Naomi's room. Sunlight poured through the large window, casting a warm glow across the blanket covering her lap. She looked up from the baby journal resting in her hands. Ethan walked to her bedside and slowly placed the small silver necklace she had returned 2 years earlier onto the table beside her. "I came back to return something that never stopped belonging to you," he said quietly. Naomi looked at the necklace for a long time before lifting her eyes to meet his. For the first time since they had been reunited, the guarded expression on her face softened ever so slightly, not because the pain had disappeared, but because she finally saw that the man standing beside her was no longer asking to be believed by his words alone. He was asking to be judged by the life he was willing to live from that moment forward. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet kind of hope that no amount of money could have purchased. Naomi remained under careful medical supervision, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to rest without feeling guilty for leaving someone else waiting. Every morning Ethan arrived before sunrise carrying nothing more than a paper cup of tea prepared exactly the way she liked it, a fresh bouquet of wildflowers gathered from the local farmer's market, and a notebook where he had begun writing letters to the child they had not yet met. He did not speak about business, stock prices, or corporate victories. Instead, he read aloud from children's storybooks, helped elderly visitors carry their belongings through the hospital corridors, and spent long afternoons quietly sitting beside Naomi whenever words were unnecessary. The nurses soon noticed that the woman who had always insisted on worrying about everyone else had finally begun smiling again. Weeks later, after careful treatment and patient recovery, Dr. Harris entered Naomi's room with the first genuinely joyful smile Ethan had seen on his face. "Both of you are doing much better," he said. "Keep following the plan, and I believe we are looking at a healthy future." Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second as gratitude washed over him. Naomi reached for his hand without thinking, and neither of them pulled away. It was a simple gesture, but after everything they had endured, it felt larger than any promise either of them could have spoken. A month later, on a peaceful spring morning, sunlight streamed through the hospital windows as soft cries announced the arrival of their son. Ethan stood beside Naomi, his eyes filled with tears he made no attempt to hide, as the nurse carefully placed the tiny baby into her waiting arms. The little boy wrapped impossibly small fingers around Ethan's hand, and in that instant every boardroom, every headline, and every fortune he had ever built seemed insignificant beside the life resting between them. They named him Caleb, a name Naomi had quietly written inside her journal many months before. Ethan smiled when he learned she had chosen it long before she knew whether he would ever return. "You always believed there was still hope," he whispered. Naomi looked down at their son before answering softly. "I believed hope was something we chose, even when life gave us every reason to stop." Several months later, the three of them returned to the same community center where their story had first begun. Children laughed as volunteers prepared breakfast, just as they had years before. This time Ethan arrived openly, not as a billionaire hiding beneath a baseball cap, but simply as Caleb's father carrying folding chairs beside his wife. The volunteers welcomed them without ceremony because kindness had always mattered more than status within those walls. Richard Caldwell visited later that afternoon, quietly watching his son wash dishes beside Naomi exactly as he had on the day they first met. The older man approached slowly before offering Naomi a sincere apology for every decision that had contributed to their pain. Naomi accepted it with quiet grace, not because the past had been erased, but because forgiveness had always been stronger than resentment inside her heart. As the sun began setting beyond the neighborhood rooftops, Ethan, Naomi, and little Caleb walked home hand in hand beneath a sky painted with warm shades of gold. The evening breeze carried the scent of blooming magnolia trees, while Caleb slept peacefully against Ethan's shoulder. There were no reporters, no flashing cameras, and no grand speeches waiting for them. Only the gentle sound of their footsteps moving together down an ordinary sidewalk, where love had finally stopped proving itself through sacrifice and had instead become something much quieter, much steadier, and infinitely stronger because this time, no one walked away.